What I'm about to tell you is real. There are things in this world that we're better off not knowing about. I used to work security at Meridian Industrial Complex, a sprawling warehouse facility about 40 miles outside of Cedar Rapids. The place was massive, 12 interconnected buildings spread across nearly 200 acres, housing everything from auto parts to medical supplies. During the day, it was bustling with workers, forklifts, and the constant hum of productivity. But at night, it became something else entirely. The night shift was just me and Bill Henderson, a guy in his late 50s who'd been working security there for almost 15 years. Bill was the kind of man who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by much. He had this way of walking that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, and he chain-smoked Marlboro Reds like they were going out of style. When I started working there in October of 2020, Bill took me under his wing and taught me the ropes. The thing about this place, he told me on my first night, is that it's got its own personality. You'll learn to feel it after a while. Some nights it's quiet as a church. Other nights? He paused to take a long drag from his cigarette. Other nights it likes to mess with you. I thought he was just being dramatic. Every old-timer has stories about their workplace, right? But as the weeks passed, I started to understand what he meant. The complex had a way of making you feel like you weren't alone, even when you knew you were. Sounds carried differently in the dark, footsteps seemed to echo from empty hallways, and the settling of the buildings took on an almost rhythmic quality that could make your imagination run wild. Our routine was simple enough. We'd start at 11 p.m., check in at the main security office in Building A, and then do our rounds. The complex was divided into 4 quadrants, and we'd alternate who took which section each night. Each round took about an hour and a half, and we'd do them every 2 hours until 7 a.m. Between rounds, we'd hang out in the security office, play cards, or watch whatever was on the small TV Bill had smuggled in. The security office was located in the center of Building A, which housed mostly office equipment and supplies. It was a small room with cinder block walls painted an institutional beige, fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly, and a bank of monitors showing feeds from the various security cameras throughout the complex. The cameras were old, installed sometime in the early 2000s, and the picture quality was grainy at best. Half of them had dead zones where the image would cut out for a few seconds before flickering back to life. Building A was connected to Building B through a long corridor lined with storage rooms. Building B was where they kept the automotive parts, thousands of boxes of brake pads, filters, and engine components stacked on metal shelving that stretched up to the 20-foot ceiling. The fluorescent lights in Building B were on motion sensors, so as you walked through, sections would illuminate ahead of you while the areas behind you faded back into darkness. Buildings C and D were connected to B through a covered walkway that crossed a small loading dock. These buildings housed medical supplies and electronics respectively. Building C always smelled like disinfectant and latex, while Building D had the distinct electronic smell, a mixture of plastic and metal with a hint of ozone. The rest of the complex spread out from their buildings E through L were connected through a series of corridors and walkways that formed a rough grid pattern. Some sections were climate controlled, others weren't. Some had their own power systems, others didn't. The whole place was like a small city, complete with its own quirks and personality. For the first month, everything was routine. Bill and I would split up for the rounds, checking doors, looking for anything out of place, and making sure the various environmental systems were running properly. The most exciting thing that happened was when we found a family of raccoons that had somehow gotten into Building F and were having a field day with a shipment of pet food. But then came November. I remember the exact date because it was November 13th, a Friday, naturally. The weather had been unusually cold for that time of year, and there had been reports of an early winter storm moving through the area. Bill and I were in the security office around 1:30 a.m., just finishing up our first round, when we heard it. It was a sound like someone dragging something heavy across a concrete floor. It seemed to be coming from Building D, which was in my section for that night. The sound lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. "You hear that?" I asked Bill. He looked up from the hand of solitaire he was playing. "Hear what?" "That dragging sound. Like someone moving something heavy." Bill listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably just the building settling. These old places make all kinds of noises." But I knew what I'd heard. It wasn't the random creaking of a building settling, it was rhythmic, deliberate. Like someone was dragging a body across the floor. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed toward Building D. The corridor from A to B was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that seemed to move as I walked. The motion sensors in Building B triggered as I passed through, creating a pathway of light that followed me like a spotlight. The covered walkway between B and D was always the creepiest part of the complex at night. It was about 50 feet long, with windows on both sides that looked out onto the loading dock. During the day, you could see the truck bays and the employee parking lot. At night, the windows just reflected your own image back at you, making it feel like you were being watched by multiple versions of yourself. Building D was quiet when I entered. The motion sensors triggered, illuminating rows of shelving filled with electronics, computers, tablets, smartphones, and various components. The air smelled like that distinctive electronic smell, but there was something else underneath it. Something organic and unpleasant. I walked through the building methodically, checking each aisle. Everything seemed normal. The security door at the far end was locked, the emergency exit alarms were set, and there were no signs of disturbance. But that smell was getting stronger. I followed it to the back corner of the building, where they kept the larger items: televisions, computer monitors, and printers. The smell was definitely coming from this area, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. It was like something had died and was rotting, but there was nothing visible. I keyed my radio. "Bill, this is Mike. I'm in Building D. There's a strange smell back here. You might want to come take a look." "What kind of smell?" Bill's voice crackled through the radio. "Like something died. It's pretty bad." There was a pause, then, "I'll be right there." While I waited for Bill, I continued investigating. The smell seemed to be strongest near a section of shelving that held old computer monitors. I shined my flashlight up and down the shelves, but everything looked normal. Then I noticed that one of the monitors, an old CRT model, was sitting slightly askew on its shelf. I reached up to straighten it, and that's when I saw the source of the smell. Behind the monitor, wedged between two boxes, was a dead rat. But it wasn't just any dead rat, it looked like it had been deliberately placed there. It was positioned on its back with its legs spread out, almost like it was on display. And around it, arranged in a perfect circle, were small white objects that looked like teeth. I jerked my hand back and nearly dropped my flashlight. What the hell was this? Jesus Christ, Bill's voice came from behind me. I turned to see him walking up, covering his nose with his sleeve. What is that smell? Look at this, I said, pointing my flashlight at the dead rat. Bill moved closer and peered at the scene. His face went pale. What the fuck is that? I don't know. But someone put it there. Look at how it's arranged. Bill stared at the display for a long moment. Those aren't teeth, he said finally. Those are rice grains. I looked again. He was right, the small white objects were rice grains, arranged in a perfect circle around the dead rat. But that didn't make it any less disturbing. Who would do something like this? I asked. Bill shook his head. I don't know. But we need to document it and report it to management. We took photos with our phones and filled out an incident report. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, we showed it to the facility manager, a no-nonsense woman named Janet Morrison. She looked at the photos and listened to our explanation with a skeptical expression. Probably just some sick joke by one of the day shift workers, she said. I'll have someone clean it up and look into it. But I knew it wasn't a joke. The way the rat was positioned, the perfect circle of rice grains, it looked ritualistic, like some kind of offering or symbol. And the fact that it was hidden behind a monitor where it wouldn't be found unless someone was specifically looking for it suggested that whoever did it didn't want it to be discovered quickly. The incident bothered me for the rest of the week. I found myself checking that corner of Building D every night, looking for any other signs of disturbance. But everything remained normal until the following Friday. November 20th. Bill and I were doing our 3:30 a.m. round when we heard it again, that same dragging sound. But this time it was coming from Building F, and this time, Bill heard it too. That's not the building settling, he said, stubbing out his cigarette. That's someone moving something. We both grabbed our flashlights and headed toward Building F. This building was used for overflow storage, miscellaneous items that didn't fit the categories of the other buildings. It was less organized than the others, with boxes and pallets stacked in seemingly random patterns. The motion sensors triggered as we entered, but several of the fluorescent bulbs were burned out, creating pockets of shadow between the illuminated areas. The dragging sound had stopped, but we could hear something else now, a soft scraping, like fingernails on concrete. "Hello?" Bill called out. "Security. Is someone in here?" The scraping stopped. We split up and began searching the building. The sound had seemed to come from the central area, where they kept furniture and larger items. I moved through the aisles methodically, checking behind boxes and under tables. The silence was oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound you make. I was checking behind a stack of office chairs when I heard Bill's voice from the other side of the building. "Mike. You need to see this." I found him standing in front of a large metal cabinet, his flashlight trained on something on the floor. As I got closer, I could see what had caught his attention. There were scratches in the concrete floor, long, parallel lines that looked like they'd been made by fingernails or claws. They formed a rough circle about 6 feet in diameter, and in the center of the circle was another dead rat, positioned the same way as the first one, surrounded by rice grains. But this display was different. This rat was fresh, so fresh that rigor mortis hadn't set in yet. And the rice grains weren't just scattered around it, they were arranged in a specific pattern, forming what looked like symbols or letters. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Bill was examining the scratches on the floor. "These are fresh too. Look at the concrete dust around them." I knelt down to get a better look at the rice grain pattern. The symbols were crude but deliberate, they almost looked like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. There were 13 symbols total, arranged in a circle around the rat. "We need to call the police," I said. "And tell them what?" "That someone is leaving dead rats around the warehouse?" Bill shook his head. "They'll think we're crazy." "This isn't normal, Bill. Someone is sneaking into the building and doing this. This is breaking and entering at the very least." Bill looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. But let's document everything first. And let's check the other buildings to see if there are any more of these things." We spent the next hour searching the entire complex. We found 2 more displays, one in Building G and one in Building J. Each one was identical, a fresh dead rat positioned on its back with rice grains arranged in symbolic patterns around it, all within scratched circles on the concrete floor. By the time we finished documenting everything, it was almost 6 a.m. We called the police, and 2 officers arrived about an hour later. They took our statements and photos, but I could tell they weren't taking it very seriously. "Probably just some kids playing a prank," one of them said. "You'd be surprised what teenagers will do when they're bored." But I knew this wasn't teenagers. The displays were too sophisticated, too ritualistic. And how would kids get into a secured warehouse complex without triggering any alarms? The police filed a report, and Janet Morrison promised to review the security footage and look into upgrading the locks on some of the exterior doors. But I had the feeling that nothing would come of it. The next week was quiet. No strange sounds, no dead rats, no mysterious symbols. I started to think that maybe the police visit had scared off whoever was doing this. Bill seemed to think so too. He was back to his usual routine of cards and cigarettes, and he stopped checking the corners of buildings during his rounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was subtle at first, just a sense that someone was observing us from the shadows. But as the days passed, it became stronger. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, hear footsteps that seemed to match my pace, and sometimes I'd feel like someone was standing right behind me. The security cameras weren't much help. The footage was grainy and dark, and the blind spots meant that large sections of the complex weren't covered. But I spent hours reviewing the recordings from the nights when we'd found the displays, looking for any sign of an intruder. I never found anything definitive, but there were anomalies. Shadows that moved independently of any visible cause. Doors that appeared to be open in one frame and closed in the next. And in Building D, on the night we found the first rat, there was a section of footage where the camera seemed to be pointed at something just off-screen, like it was following movement that wasn't visible in the frame. December brought the first major snowstorm of the season. The complex was partially shut down for 2 days while the maintenance crew cleared the parking lots and walkways. When we returned to work, something had changed. The atmosphere in the complex felt different, heavier, more oppressive. The shadows seemed darker, the sounds more pronounced. And there was a smell that I couldn't identify, something that reminded me of damp earth and decay. Bill noticed it too. "This place feels different," he said as we started our first round back. "Like something's been disturbed." He was right. The complex felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And we didn't have to wait long. On December 15th, a Tuesday, we found the next display. But this one was different from the others. It was in Building A, just down the hall from our security office. The rat was positioned the same way as the others, but the rice grain symbols were more elaborate. They formed what looked like a map or diagram. And scratched into the concrete around the circle were words in English: "They are coming." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who was coming? And why was whoever doing this escalating their behavior? "We need to stake out the complex," I told Bill. "Hide somewhere and watch for whoever is doing this." Bill shook his head. "Are you crazy? What if this person is dangerous? Then we call for backup. But we can't just keep finding these things and not do anything about it." After some discussion, we decided to set up a watch in Building C. It was centrally located and had good sightlines to most of the other buildings. We could position ourselves in the office area and watch the corridors through the windows. The next night, we put our plan into action. We did our regular rounds until 2 a.m., then I hid in Building C while Bill continued the normal routine. The idea was that whoever was doing this would think we were following our usual pattern and wouldn't expect to be watched. I positioned myself in a second-floor office that overlooked the main corridor. The building was dark except for the emergency lighting, and I had a clear view of the walkways leading to buildings D, E, and F. I kept my radio on low volume so I could hear Bill's check-ins. For the first hour, nothing happened. I watched the empty corridors and tried to stay alert. The darkness played tricks on my eyes. Shadows seemed to move, and I kept thinking I saw figures in the distance that turned out to be equipment or boxes. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard Bill's voice on the radio: "Mike, I'm starting my round of the south buildings. Everything's quiet on my end." "Copy that," I whispered back. "Nothing to report here." But as soon as I finished speaking, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure moving through the corridor below me. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark hooded robe. It moved with an odd, gliding gait, as if its feet weren't quite touching the ground. And it was heading directly toward Building D. I keyed my radio. "Bill, we have someone in the complex. Unknown individual in dark clothing heading toward Building D." "I'm on my way," Bill's voice crackled back. I watched the figure disappear into Building D, then quickly made my way down to the first floor. By the time I reached the corridor, Bill was already there, breathing hard from running. "Where did they go?" he asked. "Building D. They went in about 2 minutes ago." We approached the building carefully. The motion sensors triggered as we entered, but the lighting revealed nothing unusual. We split up and began searching the aisles, but the figure seemed to have vanished. "Check the back corner," I told Bill. "Where we found the first rat." I made my way to the rear of the building, expecting to find another display. But instead, I found something much worse. The entire back wall of the building was covered in symbols, the same type of symbols we'd been seeing made from rice grains, but these were carved directly into the concrete wall. They covered an area about 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall, and they were deep enough that they must have taken hours to create. And in the center of the symbols, at about eye level, was a message in English. "The door is opening." I stared at the wall in shock. This level of vandalism would have required power tools and hours of uninterrupted work. When had someone had the time to do this? "Bill," I called out. "You need to see this." But there was no response. "Bill?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I keyed my radio. "Bill, where are you?" Static. A chill ran down my spine. I made my way back through the building, calling Bill's name. The motion sensors triggered as I moved, creating a path of light that followed me through the aisles. But there was no sign of Bill anywhere. I searched the entire building twice, then expanded my search to the connecting corridors. Nothing. It was as if Bill had simply vanished. I was standing in the main corridor, trying to decide what to do next, when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was Bill's voice, but it was coming from above me from the ceiling. "Mike," the voice said. "Help me." I looked up, but there was nothing there except the drop ceiling tiles and fluorescent fixtures. But the voice was definitely coming from above. "Bill? Where are you?" "I'm trapped," the voice said. "I can't move." I looked around frantically for a way to access the ceiling space. There was a maintenance ladder in Building B that I could use to climb up and move the ceiling tiles. I ran to get it, my heart pounding. When I returned with the ladder, Bill's voice was still coming from the ceiling, but now it sounded different, distorted, like it was coming through water. "Mike, don't leave me here. Please." I set up the ladder and climbed up to the ceiling. I pushed aside one of the tiles and shined my flashlight into the space above. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Bill was there, but he was wrong. His body was twisted and contorted, wrapped in what looked like thick, black rope or vine. His eyes were open, but they were completely white, and his mouth was moving silently. The voice I was hearing wasn't coming from him, it was coming from somewhere else in the ceiling space. "Bill." I reached toward him, but as soon as I touched the black rope, it recoiled like it was alive. Bill's body jerked, and for a moment his eyes focused on me. "Run," he whispered. "Run now." The black rope began to move, pulling Bill deeper into the ceiling space. I tried to grab him, but the rope was too strong. Within seconds, both Bill and the rope had disappeared into the darkness above. I climbed down from the ladder, my hands shaking. I needed to call for help, but my radio was dead, nothing but static on all channels. I ran back to the security office to use the landline, but the phone was dead too. I was alone in the complex with whatever had taken Bill. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the exit, but when I reached the main door, it wouldn't open. The electronic lock was engaged, and my key card wasn't working. I tried the emergency exits, but they were all locked too. I was trapped. I made my way back to the security office and tried to think. The complex had a backup generator and an independent phone system for emergencies. If I could get to the maintenance area in Building L, I might be able to restore communications and call for help. But first, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I pulled up the security camera feeds on the monitors. Most of them showed empty corridors and storage areas, but one camera in Building D showed something that made my stomach drop. The back wall, the one covered in symbols, was glowing with a faint blue light. And in front of the wall, there were figures moving around. They were tall and thin, wearing dark robes, and they seemed to be performing some kind of ritual. I counted at least 6 figures, but it was hard to tell because they kept moving in and out of the camera's field of view. They were arranged in a circle, and in the center of the circle was something that looked like an altar or table. On the table was a human form. Even through the grainy camera feed, I could tell it was Bill. I had to do something. I couldn't just leave him there. I gathered up everything I could use as weapons, a flashlight, a crowbar from the maintenance closet, and a small knife from my lunch kit. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I made my way back to Building D, moving as quietly as possible. The motion sensors were a problem, they would announce my presence with their lighting. But I had memorized the layout well enough to navigate in the dark. As I approached the building, I could hear something, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The sound seemed to be coming from the back of the building, where the symbols were carved into the wall. I slipped inside and made my way through the aisles, using the shelving to hide my movement. The chanting was getting louder, and I could see a faint blue glow emanating from the back corner. When I reached the last aisle, I peered around the corner and saw something that defied explanation. The carved symbols on the wall were definitely glowing, pulsing with a blue light that seemed to come from within the concrete itself. And in front of the wall, just as I'd seen on the camera, 6 robed figures were arranged in a circle around a makeshift altar. Bill was on the altar, but he was conscious and aware. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was struggling against restraints that looked like the same black rope I'd seen in the ceiling. The figures were chanting in unison, and with each verse, the symbols on the wall glowed brighter. I had to act fast. I gripped the crowbar and prepared to charge into the circle, but before I could move, one of the figures turned toward me. I couldn't see its face under the hood, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight. It raised one arm and pointed directly at me, and the other figures stopped chanting and turned in my direction. That's when I saw their faces. They weren't human. The features were wrong, too elongated, with skin that looked like it was stretched over bone. Their eyes were completely black, and their mouths were filled with rows of sharp teeth. One of them spoke, and its voice was the same distorted sound I'd heard coming from the ceiling when I thought it was Bill. "You are not supposed to be here," it said. "You are not part of the arrangement." "Let him go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Whatever you want, take me instead." The creature tilted its head, as if considering the offer. "You do not understand what you are offering. Your friend was chosen. He has been prepared." "Prepared for what?" "For the crossing. The door is opening, and we need guides to show us the way." I looked at Bill, who was still struggling against his restraints. "What door? What are you talking about?" The creature gestured toward the glowing symbols on the wall. "The barrier between worlds grows thin. Soon, our realm and yours will touch, and when they do, we will need those who know your world to help us navigate it." "You're insane," I said. "I'm calling the police. Your devices will not function here. We have seen to that." And the police would not understand what they were witnessing. The creature was right about the devices. My radio and cell phone were still dead. But I had to try something. Why Bill? Why not someone else? He has been here the longest. He knows the complex better than anyone. He will make an excellent guide. I realized that the creatures had been watching us for months, learning our routines and habits. The dead rats, the symbols, the mysterious sounds, they had all been part of some elaborate plan to prepare for this moment. "What if I refuse to let you take him?" The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. "Then you will take his place, and he will be released. But you cannot save him by fighting us. There are too many of us, and you are only one." As if to emphasize the point, more figures emerged from the shadows. They had been hidden throughout the building, waiting. I counted at least 12 of them now, all moving toward me with that same gliding gait. I was outnumbered and outmatched. But I couldn't just let them take Bill. I raised the crowbar and charged toward the altar. I managed to reach Bill and started hitting his restraints with the crowbar, trying to break the black rope. But it was like hitting steel cable, the rope wouldn't budge. "Mike, don't," Bill whispered. "You can't win this. Just run." The creatures surrounded me, but they didn't attack. They just stood there, watching, as if they were waiting for something. "Your friend is wise," the lead creature said. "You cannot free him with violence. But we will make you the same offer we made him. Join us willingly, and you will be treated well. Resist, and you will be forced to serve anyway." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Come with us when the door opens. Help us understand your world. Guide us to the places where humans gather, so that we may select others to join us." I looked at the glowing symbols on the wall, then at Bill, then at the creatures surrounding me. There had to be another way. "How long do I have to decide?" "The door opens at dawn. That gives you." The creature paused, as if calculating. 2 hours. "And if I agree, you'll let Bill go?" "Yes. He will be free to leave, and his memories of this night will be adjusted." I didn't believe them for a second, but I needed time to think. "I want to talk to Bill first." "Alone?" The creatures looked at each other, then the leader nodded. "You have 5 minutes." They backed away, but I could tell they were still watching. I moved closer to Bill and pretended to whisper in his ear, but I was actually looking around for any possible escape route. "Listen carefully," I whispered. "I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, try to roll off the altar and run for the exit. Don't look back, don't try to help me, just run." "Mike, no. They'll kill you." "Maybe. But I'm not going to let them take you to wherever they're from." I had noticed something while examining the symbols on the wall. The blue glow was brightest in the center, where the carved lines intersected. If I could disrupt that intersection somehow, maybe I could interfere with whatever process was opening their door. I still had the small knife from my lunch kit. It wasn't much, but if I could jam it into the central intersection and maybe short-circuit whatever was happening. "Time is up," the lead creature said. What is your decision? I stood up and faced them. I need to see this door you're talking about. I want to know what I'm agreeing to. The creature gestured toward the wall. It is there. Can you not see it? I looked at the symbols again, and this time I could see what it was talking about. The glowing lines weren't just random patterns, they formed the outline of a doorway, about 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide. And in the center of the doorway, the air was beginning to shimmer like heat waves. It's not fully open yet, the creature explained. But when the sun rises, the barrier will be at its weakest, and we will be able to cross over. What's on the other side? Our realm. A place where the laws of your world do not apply. I pretended to consider this, while actually positioning myself closer to the wall. If I go with you, what happens to me? You will be transformed. Made more suitable for existence in our realm. It is not painful, but it is permanent. That was all I needed to hear. I lunged toward the wall and jammed the knife into the central intersection of the symbols, right where the blue glow was brightest. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The symbols flared with brilliant light, and a sound like breaking glass filled the air. The creatures recoiled, covering their faces with their hands. Run! I shouted to Bill. I twisted the knife in the carved intersection, and the light flared even brighter. The air in the doorway began to ripple and distort, like the surface of a pond when a stone is thrown into it. Bill managed to roll off the altar and started running toward the exit. But the black rope was still wrapped around his legs, and he tripped and fell. I left the knife in the wall and ran to help him. The creatures were recovering from their shock, and they were angry. Their distorted voices rose in what sounded like screams of rage. I grabbed Bill under his arms and helped him to his feet. The rope around his legs was loosening apparently, whatever power had been holding it was weakening. We stumbled toward the exit together, but the creatures were faster. They caught up to us just as we reached the main aisle. One of them grabbed my shoulder with a hand that felt like ice, and I spun around and hit it with the crowbar. The creature staggered back, but it didn't seem to be seriously hurt. The door is closing. One of them screamed. We must complete the ritual. I looked back at the wall and saw that the doorway was indeed changing. The shimmer in the air was becoming more violent, and the blue glow was fluctuating wildly. The knife was still embedded in the central intersection, but it was beginning to smoke. Bill, can you walk? I think so, he said, kicking off the last of the black rope. But my legs are numb. I helped him toward the exit, fighting off the creatures with the crowbar. They were becoming more desperate, clawing at us with their hands and trying to drag us back toward the altar. We made it to the main corridor, and I could see the exit to the parking lot just ahead. But the creatures were still following us, and they were getting more aggressive. Almost there, I told Bill. Just a little further. We reached the exit door, and I swiped my key card. For a moment, nothing happened, and I thought we were trapped. Then the lock clicked, and the door swung open. Cold air rushed in, and I could see the first hints of dawn on the horizon. We stumbled out into the parking lot, and I helped Bill to my car. Are they following us? Bill asked, looking back at the building. I looked too, but I couldn't see any of the creatures. The exit door was standing open, but the corridor beyond was dark and empty. I don't think so, I said. I think they're stuck in there until the door opens completely. I helped Bill into the passenger seat and started the car. As we drove away from the complex, I could see a strange light emanating from Building D, not the blue glow I'd seen before, but a harsh white light that flickered and pulsed. What was that light? Bill asked. I don't know, I said. But I don't think we want to find out. We drove straight to the police station and told them everything. They listened to our story with obvious skepticism, but they agreed to send a patrol car to check on the complex. The officers returned 2 hours later with strange news. They had found the building empty, but the back wall of Building D was covered in what looked like scorch marks. And in the center of the wall, there was a knife embedded in the concrete. Looks like someone tried to vandalize the wall and maybe cause some kind of electrical fire, one of the officers said. But there's no sign of any intruders now. The building is secure. They took our statements, but I could tell they thought we were either lying or having some kind of shared hallucination. Mental health professionals call it folie à deux shared psychotic disorder. Two people experiencing the same delusion simultaneously. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe the stress of working alone in that huge complex at night, combined with the isolation and the weird sounds that old buildings make, had finally gotten to us. Maybe we'd imagined the whole thing. But then how do you explain the knife in the wall? How do you explain the scorch marks? How do you explain the fact that Bill's legs were covered in rope burns where the black restraints had been? The company put us both on paid leave while they investigated the incident. Bill and I were told not to discuss what happened with anyone, and we were required to undergo psychological evaluations. The company's insurance wanted to make sure we weren't filing fraudulent claims. I spent the next week trying to convince myself that it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. If we'd imagined everything, why were our stories so consistent? Why were the physical evidence, the knife, the scorch marks, Bill's injuries all real? And there was something else that bothered me. Something I hadn't told the police. During our escape from the building, just before we reached the parking lot, I had looked back and seen something through the windows of Building D. The white light I'd mentioned was still flickering, but in the center of it, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing motionless. It was tall and thin, wearing a dark robe, and it was watching us leave. Bill called me a few days later. His voice was shaky, and he sounded like he hadn't slept in days. "Mike, I need to tell you something. I've been having dreams about that night. But they're not dreams, they're memories. I remember things that happened before you found me." "What kind of things?" "I remember being grabbed by something in Building D. It was like a shadow, but it was solid. It wrapped around me and pulled me up into the ceiling. And then I was somewhere else, not in the building, but somewhere cold and dark." "Where?" "I don't know. It was like a cave, but the walls were moving. And there were others there, people in uniforms, people in suits, people in work clothes. They were all just standing there, staring at nothing." "What happened to them?" "I don't know. But I think they were like me, people who had been taken from their jobs. Security guards, janitors, night shift workers. People who worked alone in empty buildings." The hair on my arm stood up. "How many people?" "Dozens. Maybe hundreds. And they were all waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" "For the door to open. For the crossing to begin." I felt sick. "Bill, are you saying that what happened to us has happened to other people?" "I think so. And I think it's still happening. The creatures, or whatever they are, they're collecting people. Building an army of guides who know our world." "But why? What do they want?" "I don't know. But I remember one of them saying something about the harvest. That when enough doors had been opened, they would begin the harvest." I couldn't sleep for the rest of the week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those elongated faces with their black eyes and rows of teeth. I started researching online, looking for any reports of similar incidents. What I found was disturbing. There were dozens of stories from night shift workers across the country. Security guards who reported strange symbols appearing in their buildings. Janitors who found dead animals arranged in ritualistic patterns. Maintenance workers who heard voices coming from empty rooms. Most of these reports had been dismissed as pranks or stress-related hallucinations. But when you read them together, a pattern emerged. The incidents were always in large, mostly empty buildings. They always involved lone workers or small teams. And they always escalated over time, starting with small disturbances and building to more dramatic events. But here's what really scared me: in every case I found, the workers involved had either quit their jobs or disappeared entirely. Some had been found days later, confused and disoriented, with no memory of what had happened to them. Others had never been found at all. I started calling the numbers listed in the reports, trying to reach the workers who had experienced these incidents. Most of the numbers were disconnected. A few people answered, but they claimed not to remember anything unusual happening at their jobs. But one man, a janitor named Rodriguez who worked at a medical complex in Phoenix, was willing to talk. "I remember you," he said when I explained who I was. "You're the security guard from Iowa. I read about your incident online. You experienced something similar?" 3 months ago. Same thing, dead animals, symbols, strange sounds. But it went further than what happened to you. What do you mean? They took my partner. A guy named Santos. We were working late one night, and we heard something in the basement. When we went to investigate, these things in robes were waiting for us. They had Santos before I could do anything. What did you do? I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. When I came back with the police, Santos was gone. They found him 3 days later, wandering in the desert outside of town. He couldn't remember anything about what happened, but he wasn't the same. How do you mean? He was different. Like he was sleepwalking all the time. He'd stare at nothing for hours, and sometimes he'd speak in a language I'd never heard before. His family had him committed to a psychiatric facility. Is he still there? No. He disappeared from the facility 2 weeks ago. Just walked out in the middle of the night. Nobody saw him leave, and the security cameras didn't record anything. I felt a chill run down my spine. Do you think he went back to them? I think they never let him go. I think they just made him think he was free. Rodriguez gave me the names of other workers he'd been in contact with, people who had experienced similar incidents. I spent the next several days calling them, and the stories were all variations on the same theme. Night shift workers. Empty buildings. Escalating supernatural incidents. And always, someone disappearing or being changed by the experience. I started to realize that what Bill and I had experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger and more organized. These creatures, whatever they were systematically targeting night shift workers across the country. But why? What was so special about people who worked alone in empty buildings at night? I think I figured it out when I was reviewing the security footage from our complex one more time. I had gotten a copy of the recordings from the night of the incident, and I was going through them frame by frame, looking for anything I might have missed. In the footage from Building D, just before the creatures appeared, there was something interesting. The timestamp showed that it was 3:33 a.m., the exact time when the barriers between worlds are supposed to be at their weakest, according to various occult traditions. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What caught my attention was the fact that the building was completely empty except for us. No other workers, no maintenance staff, no delivery drivers. Just two people alone in a vast complex. I think that's what they needed: isolation. Empty spaces where they could work without being observed or interrupted. And they needed people who were familiar with those spaces, who could guide them through the layouts and help them understand how our world worked. Night shift workers were perfect for their purposes. We were already isolated, already familiar with empty buildings, and already accustomed to working alone. If we disappeared, it might be days before anyone noticed. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this was happening everywhere. How many security guards, janitors, and maintenance workers had vanished over the years? How many of those disappearances had been attributed to job abandonment or personal problems? I called Bill to share my theory. He listened quietly, then said something that made my blood run cold. "Mike, I think you're right. But I think it's worse than that. I think they're not just taking people, I think they're replacing them." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Rodriguez said his partner came back, but he was different. What if that wasn't really his partner at all? What if it was one of them, disguised as a human?" The implications were terrifying. If the creatures could somehow take the form of the people they captured, they could infiltrate society at any level. They could replace key personnel in security, maintenance, and other positions that gave them access to empty buildings. "We need to warn people," I said. "Who's going to believe us? The police think we're crazy. Our employers think we're having stress breakdowns. If we start telling people that shapeshifting creatures are replacing night shift workers, they'll have us committed." He was right. But I couldn't just sit by and do nothing while more people were taken. I decided to start documenting everything. I created a website where night shift workers could report strange incidents. I wanted to create a database of similar experiences, to show the scope of what was happening. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, I had received over 300 reports from across the country. Security guards, janitors, maintenance workers, hospital orderlies, factory workers, anyone who worked alone in empty buildings at night seemed to be at risk. The stories were remarkably consistent. Strange sounds, mysterious symbols, dead animals arranged in patterns, and always, escalation towards some kind of confrontation with robed figures. But here's what really scared me: many of the reports came from people whose coworkers had already disappeared. And in several cases, those missing coworkers had returned days later, claiming to have no memory of what happened. I started trying to track down these returned workers. I wanted to interview them, to see if there were any signs that they weren't who they claimed to be. What I found was deeply disturbing. The returned workers all exhibited similar behaviors. They were emotionally flat, responded to questions with minimal answers, and seemed to have difficulty with tasks that should have been routine for them. Several had been fired for poor performance or strange behavior. More importantly, they all had gaps in their personal histories. They couldn't remember details about their families, their backgrounds, or their previous jobs. When pressed, they would become agitated and change the subject. I managed to interview one of them, a security guard named Thompson who worked at a shopping mall in Denver. He had disappeared for 4 days and returned with no memory of where he'd been. "I don't understand why everyone keeps asking me about this," he said when I called him. "I was sick. I stayed home. That's all." "But you didn't call in sick. Your supervisor said you just didn't show up for work." I was confused. The medication I was taking made me disoriented. "What medication?" There was a long pause. "I don't remember the name." "What were you being treated for?" Another pause. "I don't remember." The conversation went on like this for several minutes. Every time I asked for specific details, Thompson would claim not to remember. But when I asked general questions about his job duties or the layout of the mall, he could answer immediately and in detail. It was as if someone had erased his personal memories while leaving his professional knowledge intact. I tried to get Thompson to meet with me in person, but he refused. He said he was too busy with work, but when I called the mall, his supervisor told me that Thompson had been fired the previous week for erratic behavior and poor performance. When I called Thompson back to ask about this, the number had been disconnected. I tried tracking down other returned workers, but the pattern was always the same. They would be evasive about their personal histories, they would refuse to meet in person, and within a few weeks, they would disappear again. I began to suspect that these weren't the original workers at all. They were something else, possibly the creatures themselves, taking human form to infiltrate our society. But what was their ultimate goal? What did they want with our world? I got my answer when I received an email from someone calling themselves the archivist. The message was brief. "You are asking the right questions. But you are not ready for the answers. If you want to understand what is happening, you must see the source. Meet me at the Riverside Industrial Complex in Kansas City on November 13th at midnight. Come alone, and bring protection." November 13th. Exactly 1 year after Bill and I had our encounter. I knew it was probably a trap, but I also knew I couldn't ignore it. This person or entity seemed to have information that could help me understand what was happening. I drove to Kansas City and found the Riverside Industrial Complex. It was similar to the Meridian Complex where Bill and I had worked, a series of interconnected warehouse buildings surrounded by empty parking lots. The main gate was open, which should have been my first warning. Industrial complexes don't leave their gates open at midnight. I parked near the entrance and made my way toward the main building. The place was completely dark except for a few security lights that cast long shadows across the parking lot. I found the main entrance and discovered it was also unlocked. Inside, the building was laid out much like our old complex, long corridors connecting storage areas and office spaces. I followed the main corridor toward the center of the building, where I assumed the security office would be located. But as I walked, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl. The walls were covered in the same symbols I'd seen carved into the concrete at our complex. But these symbols were different, they were glowing with a soft red light, and they seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And there was a smell in the air, the same organic, decay-like odor I'd encountered in Building D that night. I reached the center of the building and found a large open area that might have been a loading dock or assembly area. In the center of the space, illuminated by flickering torches, was a circle of robed figures. But these weren't the same creatures Bill and I had encountered. These figures were human-sized and moved with normal human gait. As I got closer, I could see that they were wearing the faces of people I recognized from my research, Night shift workers who had disappeared over the past year. In the center of the circle was a table, and on the table was a large book bound in what looked like human skin. One of the figures was reading from the book in a language I didn't recognize. "Welcome," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see a figure approaching from the shadows. This one was different from the others, taller, more imposing, and when it spoke, its voice was clear and human-like. "I am the archivist," it said. "I have been waiting for you." "What is this place?" I asked. "This is where we keep the records. Every human who has been taken, every door that has been opened, every crossing that has been completed. It is all documented here." The archivist gestured toward the book on the table. "Would you like to see your entry?" I didn't want to, but I found myself walking toward the circle. The figures parted to let me through, and I could see that the book was open to a page covered in symbols and what looked like photographs. One of the photographs showed Bill and me during our encounter at the Meridian Complex. Another showed the robed creatures we had fought. And at the bottom of the page, in English, was a brief summary. Subjects: Michael Chen, William Henderson. Location: Meridian Industrial Complex, Iowa. Date: November 13, 2021. Outcome: partial success. Henderson prepared for crossing, but intervention by Chen disrupted the ritual. Henderson retained for future use. Chen marked for observation. Marked for observation? I asked. "You have been useful to us," the archivist said. "Your research, your website, your attempts to warn others have helped us identify more targets. Every person who contacts you, every report you receive, becomes part of our database." I felt sick. I had thought I was helping people, but I had actually been leading them into a trap. "The night shift workers who disappear," I said. "What happens to them?" "They are prepared. Their knowledge of your world is extracted and catalogued. Their bodies are repurposed for our use. And when we have enough information, we will begin the harvest." "What harvest?" The archivist smiled, and I could see that its teeth were the same sharp, predatory teeth I'd seen on the creatures at our complex. "Your world is dying," it said. "Your environment is collapsing, your resources are depleting, your society is fragmenting. Soon, it will no longer be able to support your population. When that happens, we will offer an alternative." "What kind of alternative?" "We will open doors in every major city. We will invite your people to cross over to our realm, where they will be cared for and protected. They will become part of our collective, and in return, we will preserve what is valuable about your species." "And if people refuse?" "Then they will die with their world. But most will not refuse. When faced with extinction, humans will choose any alternative that offers survival." I realized what they were planning. They weren't just taking individual night shift workers, they were preparing for a mass exodus from our world to theirs. And the people they had taken were going to be the guides who would help convince others to make the crossing. "You're planning an invasion," I said. "We prefer to think of it as a rescue operation. Your species will survive, but in a form more suited to our realm." "And what form is that?" The archivist's smile widened. "You will see, in time. But first, you have a choice to make. You can join us willingly, and help us complete our preparations. Or you can continue to resist, and be forced to serve anyway." I looked around the circle of figures. They were all watching me with the same blank, expressionless faces. But now I could see that underneath their stolen human features, something else was looking out through their eyes. "What happened to the real people?" I asked. "The night shift workers you took?" "They are still there, in a sense. Their memories, their knowledge, their personalities all preserved within our collective. They will exist forever, as part of something greater than they could ever have been alone." "That's not existence. That's imprisonment." "Is it? Or is it the ultimate form of job security? They will never be alone again, never have to worry about their next paycheck, never have to fear for their safety. They will be part of something eternal." I thought about Bill, and about all the other workers who had been taken. Were they still conscious somewhere inside these creatures? Were they aware of what was happening to them? "I want to see Bill," I said. "That can be arranged." The archivist gestured to one of the figures in the circle. It stepped forward and lowered its hood, revealing Bill's face. But it was wrong, the features were too sharp, the eyes too bright, and when it smiled, I could see those rows of predatory teeth. "Hello, Mike," it said in Bill's voice. "I've been waiting for you." "Bill? Is that really you?" "In a sense. I am what Bill has become. I have his memories, his knowledge, his personality. But I am also something more." "What do you remember about our last night at the complex?" "I remember being afraid. I remember the pain of being transformed. But I also remember the relief when it was over. The loneliness ended, Mike. The constant worry about bills and health insurance and whether I'd have a job tomorrow, all of that went away." "But you're not human anymore." "No. I'm something better. And you can be too." The Bill thing reached out toward me, and I could see that its hand was wrong, the fingers were too long, and the skin had a grayish tint. "Join us, Mike. Let us take away your pain, your fear, your loneliness. Let us make you part of something greater." I backed away from the circle. "No. I won't let you do to me what you did to Bill." "Then you have chosen to resist. That is unfortunate, but not unexpected." The archivist raised its hand, and the other figures in the circle began to move toward me. I turned and ran toward the entrance, but I could hear them following. I made it to the main corridor and ran as fast as I could toward the exit. But the building seemed to be changing around me. Corridors that had been straight when I entered were now curved, and doors that had been open were now closed. I reached what I thought was the exit, but found myself in a small room with no windows and only one door. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the sound of locks engaging. I was trapped. But then I remembered something. In my research, I had found references to protective symbols that could supposedly ward off supernatural entities. I had dismissed them as superstition, but now I was desperate enough to try anything. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to examine the walls. Like the rest of the building, they were covered in glowing symbols. But these symbols were different, they pulsed with a red light that seemed to match the rhythm of a heartbeat. I pulled out my keys and started scratching symbols into the concrete crosses, pentacles, and other protective signs I remembered from my research. I didn't know if they would work, but I had to try something. As I carved the symbols, the red glow from the walls began to flicker. The pulsing rhythm became irregular, and I could hear sounds from outside the room, sounds like something large and heavy being dragged across the floor. The door began to shake, as if something was trying to break through. But it held, and gradually, the shaking stopped. I waited in the room for what felt like hours. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police. The door opened, and a police officer shined a flashlight into the room. "Sir, are you all right?" I stumbled out of the room and found myself in the main corridor. But the building was different now, the walls were bare concrete, with no trace of the glowing symbols I'd seen before. "How did you get in here?" the officer asked. "This building has been condemned for 6 months." I looked around in confusion. The building was empty and obviously abandoned. There were no torches, no robed figures, no circle of transformed humans. I was meeting someone," I said. "Who?" "I don't know. Someone who claimed to have information about missing night shift workers." The officer looked at me with concern. "Sir, have you been drinking tonight?" "No. I'm telling you, there were people here. They were performing some kind of ritual." The officer helped me outside, where I could see that the building was clearly abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and there was a large sign declaring the property condemned. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," the officer said. "We need to get you checked out." They took me to the hospital, where I was examined by a psychiatrist. I told him everything that had happened, but I could see that he didn't believe me. "You've been under a lot of stress," he said. "What you experienced was probably a very vivid hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and anxiety." Maybe he was right. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But if that was the case, how had I ended up in a condemned building? And why did I have concrete dust under my fingernails from carving symbols into the walls? They kept me for observation for 3 days, then released me with a prescription for anti-anxiety medication. I drove home and tried to resume my normal life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My website was still active, and I was still receiving reports from night shift workers. But now I was afraid to respond to them. What if the archivist was right? What if I was actually helping these creatures identify new targets? I shut down the website and tried to forget about everything that had happened. But the reports kept coming, not to my website, but to my personal email, my phone, even my home address. Night shift workers from across the country were reaching out, desperate for help. And they were disappearing. Every week, I would get a new report from someone who was experiencing strange incidents at their workplace. I would try to warn them, tell them to quit their jobs and find somewhere safe. But within days, they would stop responding to my messages. I started tracking the disappearances, and I realized that they were accelerating. What had started as isolated incidents was becoming a nationwide phenomenon. Security guards, janitors, maintenance workers, hospital orderlies, anyone who worked alone in empty buildings at night was at risk. I tried to go to the authorities, but no one would listen. Missing persons reports were filed, but the investigations inevitably concluded that the workers had simply abandoned their jobs. There was never any evidence of foul play. But I knew the truth. The creatures were expanding their operation, preparing for whatever harvest they had planned. Then, 6 months after my encounter in Kansas City, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but inside was a photograph of Bill. He was standing in what looked like a warehouse, but he was surrounded by dozens of other people all wearing the same blank, expressionless faces I'd seen in the circle of robed figures. And in the background, I could see a large door covered in glowing symbols. On the back of the photograph was a message in Bill's handwriting. "The door is opening. Soon, all the doors will open. When they do, remember that we offered you a choice. B." I knew what it meant. The creatures were almost ready to begin their harvest. They had collected enough knowledge, enough guides, enough information about our world to begin their mass exodus operation. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I'm writing this story now because I need people to know what's happening. If you work alone at night, if you've experienced strange incidents at your workplace, if you've heard sounds that don't belong or found things that shouldn't be there, please, be careful. They're watching. They're waiting. And they're coming? I don't know when the harvest will begin. It could be tomorrow, it could be next year. But when it happens, when the doors open in every major city and the creatures emerge to offer their alternative, remember that it's not salvation they're offering. It's the end of everything that makes us human. I've tried to warn people, but no one believes me. They think I'm crazy, that I'm suffering from some kind of breakdown. Maybe I am. Maybe everything I've experienced has been a delusion brought on by stress and isolation. But if that's true, then why am I still receiving reports from night shift workers? Why are people still disappearing? And why, every night when I try to sleep, do I hear Bill's voice calling to me from somewhere far away? "Mike," the voice says. "It's time to come home. I don't think I have much time left. They're coming for me, and this time, I don't think I'll be able to escape. But maybe, if enough people read this story, if enough people understand what's happening, someone will find a way to stop them. Or maybe it's already too late. Maybe the harvest has already begun, and the people reading this story are the only ones left. If that's the case, then I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't do more to warn you. I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to stop them. And I'm sorry for what's coming next. Because they're here now. I can see them outside my window, standing in the shadows between the streetlights. They're wearing familiar faces: Bill, Rodriguez, Thompson, and dozens of others I recognize from my research. They're waiting for me to make a choice. Join them willingly, or be taken by force. I think I've made my decision. If you're reading this, then you're one of the few people who know the truth. Use that knowledge wisely. Watch for the signs. Protect yourself and the people you care about. And whatever you do, don't work the night shift alone. The door is opening. They are coming. And soon, we will all be part of something greater than we could ever have been alone. This account was found on the laptop of Michael Chen, a former security guard who disappeared from his apartment in Cedar Rapids, Iowa on March 15, 2023. The laptop was discovered by police during a wellness check requested by Chen's landlord. There were no signs of a struggle, and Chen's car was found in the parking lot of an abandoned industrial complex 40 miles outside the city. Despite an extensive search, Chen has never been found. The Meridian industrial complex referenced in his account was demolished in January 2022 following a series of electrical fires. No other employees have come forward to corroborate Chen's claims about the events described in this document.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.